As the curtain begins to fall on one era, plans for post-Gaddafi Libya already being considered. But do the different factions have a common future vision? Can the National Transitional Council handle the task? And what sort of role will Western powers seek in the new Libya? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, Muammar al-Gaddafi's regime appears to be crumbling. Though he's still at large, Libya is moving, it seems, to a new era. Western powers scramble to ensure a transition that is not marred by violence, with oil wealth and reconstruction contracts up for grab. Well, what role will the West and international powers have in post-Gaddafi Libya? Zainab Walaji has more.
Victory shots ring through Martyr Square, renamed for those who died fighting to end Gaddafi's 42-year rule. And even though he has so far avoided capture, the rhetoric is already about a post-Gaddafi Libya. But concerns plague the country, and Western leaders, having helped the rebels militarily during the uprising, are now keen to be involved in the transition. US President Obama was quick to offer his advice to the National Transitional Council.
As we move forward from this pivotal phase, the opposition should continue to take important steps to bring about a transition that is peaceful, inclusive, and just. As the leadership of the TNC has made clear, the rights of all Libyans must be respected. True justice will not come from reprisals and violence. It will come from reconciliation and a Libya that allows its citizens to determine their own destiny.
French President Sarkozy has already invited the NTC to Paris for talks. And in London, British Prime Minister David Cameron said that although he was proud of the role Britain had played in the revolution, Libya's future must be in the hands of the Libyan people.
This will be, and must be, and should be, Libyan-led and a Libyan-owned process with broad international support coordinated by the United Nations.
While Secretary General of the UN Ban Ki-moon echoed support for the NTC, he insisted that Libya, as a member of the UN, must also comply to the decisions of the International Criminal Court. They want Gaddafi, his son Saif al-Islam, and Abdullah al-Sanusi, his head of intelligence, for crimes against humanity.
It is up to ICC, and the international community has a duty. All the member states of the United Nations have duties, obligations to fully comply with the decisions of ICC.
Rebel fighters, however, see it differently. They want them to face trial in Libya before a Libyan court. So it appears cracks between the NTC and the West are surfacing, with foreign powers and Libyans already disagreeing on what to do with Gaddafi even before he has been captured. But a hard line seems unlikely from the West. A fact the Libyans know all too well. After all, theirs is a country rich in oil. Zainab Walaji for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring our guests into the discussion now. We're joined from Washington, D.C. by Ambassador Kurt Volker. He's the former U.S. permanent representative to NATO in 2009. From London, Alexander Nekrasov, political analyst and former advisor to the Kremlin. And from Paris, Pierre Rosselin, foreign editor at Le Figaro newspaper in France. I should also mention that we tried to host a member of the Libyan Transitional National Council on this show, but no one was available. Thank you all for joining us. If I could start perhaps with Mr. Rosselin, how easy is it going to be to build a democratic country functioning on civilian institutions when you don't really have that much of a civil society flourishing in Libya, do you?
Well, obviously, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, we have seen how difficult it has been in Iraq, and it is still in Afghanistan. So obviously, it's very difficult. But I believe at this point we are still trying to get rid of Gaddafi. So maybe we should reflect on this very moment. And surely it will be very difficult. And the future will need everybody to get together, whether it is inside the country, inside Libya, or outside in the international community. And I believe France is ready to play its part, as it has played its part in the phases that have brought us to this point, with the fall of Gaddafi being pretty soon, we hope, we all hope.
Well, it does certainly seem to be the case that France is willing to play a role. If I could take the question, though, to Mr. Nekrasov. Everybody coming together, we've heard from Mr. Ruslan, to try and help the situation. Does that kind of leave the door too much open for an exaggerated foreign influence in the next order that arises if civil society is not that developed?
Well, I think the problem will be that many people in Libya will see the new government as totally dependent on NATO. And that's the problem, by the way, that happened in Iraq as well, where the situation currently is very unstable.
But they didn't send ground troops into Libya, did they? As was the case, at least not large scale.
But let's face it. When NATO started to support one side in the civil war, basically this side is associated with NATO. And if you realize that they had all those bombing sorties happening every day, there were special forces on the ground, that is already a known fact. The CIA was operating on the ground. There were advisors in Benghazi from Britain, France, and America. So what will happen is that a lot of people in Libya will see this as a foreign-inspired regime. And that is why the danger is that there will be serious divisions not only within the regime itself, but within the society there. And don't forget that Libya was a prospering country compared to many other countries in the region. And a lot of people will be watching how the new regime will try to get the standards of living back to where they were before. And I don't think it's an easy task, even with the billions that NATO is throwing at Libya at the moment.
Okay, I want to jump in here. Let me try and bring Ambassador Volker into the discussion. Of course, you have a lot of experience with NATO, don't you? Do you think NATO's intervention in this conflict is setting up the next administration for credibility problems, as we're hearing from Mr. Nekrasov?
No, I really don't think so. And I think that the situation is fundamentally different from what we've seen in either Iraq or Afghanistan. This all began with the people of Libya in Tripoli itself protesting against a dictator who had been in place for over 40 years. He went after those people with brutal military force and intelligence services, and that launched a rebellion. They could only defend themselves by fighting back. But as unarmed civilians, they needed support and help. And so NATO provided that support. But from the beginning and throughout, it has been a Libyan-driven process by the people trying to gain control of their own country.
Ambassador,
and
some would argue,
this weekend, they're starting now to do so.
Some would argue, though, that NATO has gone beyond its mandate of simply protecting civilians, as in the Resolution 1973, hasn't it?
Yes, thank goodness. I think if it tried to limit itself to that role, we would still be seeing civilians suffering in Libya. The problem is that you can't protect civilians when one side has a monopoly of military force and is using that to kill civilians. The only way to actually protect them is to go after the armed elements of the regime itself. And so NATO, thank goodness, began to do that in coordination and support of the rebels.
All right, I could see Mr. Nekrasov laughing there. I guess you don't agree with regime change as one of the goals for NATO.
How can you go beyond the mandate of the United Nations resolution? Now, if you look at the text of the resolution, you would see that NATO has broken most of the important terms of that resolution. The resolution specifically stated that this should not be an operation targeted at regime change. That was broken. The resolution specifically stated that no sides in the conflict should be armed from the outside. NATO broke this term again. The resolution also stated that only diplomacy should be used to get this crisis resolved. NATO broke this term as well. So you can't just go beyond the remit of the United Nations resolution and say, well, because we don't like that regime, we would like to get rid of it. That's what happened with Saddam.
Okay. Let's bring in the ambassador for a response to that.
Well, I think the important thing is it's the Libyan people themselves changing their own regime. This is not being done from outside by NATO. NATO did provide direct support to the rebels because they frankly needed it. They couldn't do this on their own without the air support that NATO provided. But this was a Libyan-driven process. I understand the concerns that our Russian colleague has about the letter of the UN resolution. I'm sure there are people who will argue that, well, the only way to accomplish that was indeed to support the rebels. But the bottom line is to look at the pictures that are happening in Tripoli right now and happening across Libya. This is the people of a country finally gaining control of their destiny again after 4 decades.
All right, if I could bring Mr. Ruslan into the discussion, let's try and look forward a little bit. We know that France is already calling for meetings to be held, inviting members of the opposition to Paris to try and talk about the next stage. Is France jumping the gun a little bit?
Well, I think somebody has to jump the gun. I mean, we need to have some impulse to get things moving. We've seen that in the past. If we had listened to our Russian colleagues, nothing would have happened and Gaddafi would still be in power. And Russia would probably be very happy with him. But things have to change in the Arab world. They're changing. I think France can do what it can. It is not a superpower. It will not by itself change things in the Arab world, but it can help, and Europe has to help because after all, these are our neighbors, and what's going on in Libya will have a huge impact on neighboring countries and will eventually have an impact on Europe and also all the way up to Russia. So this is an important
would you say that,
thing,
Mr. Ruslan,
and we have to take things seriously.
The reason why France, of all the countries in particular, even in Europe, is moving so quickly, is it to guarantee French influence in the post-Gaddafi order that arises?
Well, you know, France has always had a very active policy vis-à-vis the Arab world. This is a historical thing, and it's continuing. And you can say that France will grab all the oil in Libya, which is a very, very easy argument to make, but it's totally ridiculous. It's just like the argument that was made about Iraq. So I believe, sincerely believe, that France
apparently didn't even coordinate its position
in these countries and has to defend them.
Right, but France apparently didn't even coordinate its position with Britain, its other ally, who is participating in support for the opposition. Is there an element of competition emerging now, but even between Western and European countries in the race for influence in post-Gaddafi Libya?
I think you're fine-tuning this much too much. I really believe between Paris and London there was quite a lot of cooperation up to now. I don't see why there will be any major rift between those two countries. Of course, each country will defend its interests, will try to get contracts and all that, but I really think at this point this is secondary.
All right, let's bring in Mr. Nekrasov for a view on that. Do you think some countries, perhaps like Russia and China, may be losing out in the next order that arises?
Well, of course they will be losing out, because if you look at Iraq, which is producing more oil than Kuwait each day now, if you look at the companies that are operating, the oil companies, there would be American and British companies dominating there. So you would see the same thing happening in Libya, that the NATO countries would be the ones who would be running all the big contracts. But what I find quite amazing is that the current new regime in Libya, the emerging regime, is saying to the Russians, well, you didn't support that resolutions, now you will lose out on the oil contracts, which is quite fascinating, because Russia was actually not the only big country that abstained from this resolution. Don't forget China, India, Brazil and Germany, of all countries, abstained during the voting on that resolution. And the reason why they abstained was because they had their doubts about this resolution. They had their doubts because they thought that that NATO would go much further than the resolution, which it did. And by the way, if NATO is prepared to undermine the international law, it should not complain afterwards that other countries do not trust it at all.
But given what's happened now, do you think perhaps it was a mistake for Russia and China and other countries perhaps not to reach out more to the opposition side?
No, I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was quite a clear position, considering, again, that 5 big nations have decided to abstain. And I think the game was already there, clear to see by the West and NATO that they were going to interfere. And by the way, anti-Western feeling will grow in the Middle East and North Africa because of the way that NATO will be perceived as trying to grab the natural resources of Libya. You know, there's already talk on the internet about the gold reserves, where are they, about other things, and I don't think that actually NATO played its cards very well here, and there will be a lot of resentment across the world, because what the West does not understand is that you cannot humiliate small countries just because you feel like it. You cannot do this and then expect to be respected by the world community. At the moment, the credibility of NATO and the United Nations, along with Ban Ki-moon, is approaching zero, probably.
All right, let's bring in Ambassador once again to this discussion. You know what some people are suggesting? We might have a Middle East once again divided between pro and anti-Western camps, but only the members now this time may change after the Arab Spring. So we might have a pro or a Western-friendly regime emerging in Libya, but in Egypt and Tunisia you might have the opposite. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, I'd like to come back to a couple of the earlier points, and I'll address yours as well. The first thing to point out is that the resources of Libya have not been serving the people of Libya for the past 40 years already. So that's what we saw under Gaddafi, where it was a regime and a family that was profiting from this, not the people of the country themselves. So this is the first opportunity for that really to change. And I do believe that the Transitional Council will be much more conscientious about that as they move forward in setting up a government. Second, the reputation and role of the United States or of Western countries has been under attack in the Arab world for years already, mainly because of the hypocrisy of supporting brutal regimes and while talking about democracy. So this is also something that's now beginning to change. When the people of Tunisia or Libya or Egypt are standing up and demanding a better future for themselves, and we are finally supporting them, this is an opportunity for the reputations of the Western countries actually to be improved. So I think that there is a lot of positive signs in this looking forward. Now, looking at Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, I think the real risks are that the regime changes that have taken place are not yet solid. And we're seeing examples in Egypt, for example, that are worrying about some of the people who led the protests being brought in for questioning again. I think what we really want to see is a stable, peaceful transition to genuine democratic rule and governance by the people of the countries themselves.
Okay, but
with that, I'm confident that they will have good partners for all of the Western countries.
How will the West view, for example, Islamist elements in the Libyan opposition, for example?
Two things. First off, Islam is a part of all of these countries, and to try to deny that would be foolhardy. It is a fact that the people of these countries believe in Islam. It is a part of their identity, and it shouldn't be excluded from the way they run their countries. That is separate from saying that there should not be, that Islam is against democracy or that all Islam is extremism. It's not. And so where there is extremism, violence, terrorism, or anti-democratic practices and sentiment, that's something to oppose. But that's separate from the idea of Islam.
Okay, but I mean, so you don't think that the West is going to try and perhaps divide the emerging elements of the emerging new order in Libya or elsewhere in the Arab Spring into a sort of you're the moderate camp where we like you, you're the not so moderate camp, we will undermine you, and we will encourage this division within the emerging new order and regime?
Well, I think it's the other way around. I think it's the people of the countries themselves are looking to demonstrate that they can govern their own countries without the two extremes of either a dictatorship that imposes an order on people or Islamist extremists who seek to impose a different kind of order on people. I think that there is a broad middle ground of people governing their countries responsibly for the benefit of the citizens of those countries. That's what I think the people there want, and that's what certainly any outside power would want to see supported.
Okay, do you agree with that, Mr. Nekrasov, that any outside power would want to see the people?
I don't agree. I don't agree with that for several reasons. First of all, America has shown its readiness to support dictatorships like the Saudi Arabian regime, which, unlike the Libyan regime, which was actually reinvesting some of the oil money. That's why Libya was one of the most prosperous countries in the region, whereas the Saudi regime is basically a family-run regime, and they take all the oil money, and everybody knows that. And America stays quiet about that because that suits them. Also, it's a very strange way to say that America was, yes, supporting those dictators, and now it's supporting the people. No, America has to change its policy because some of those dictators just couldn't hold on to power. So now it's looking for more, for new allies, and it's not a sort of a very simple way of, no, America has changed its attitude. We will always come back to Saudi Arabia because that is a clear-cut example of how America deals with other countries and you know, picks its allies.
Well, it's not
and
just.
I think what is damaging.
If I can jump in, it's not just America. Let's not forget. It's not just America that's leading this. France is playing a very leading role, shall we say? Let's go over once again to Mr. Russelin. Do you agree with that analysis of a perhaps continuation of a realpolitik, interest-based policy towards the Middle East is the real explanation for how we're seeing the West deal with the emerging order in Libya?
Well, I think there's a very simple explanation. I think there are things going on in the Middle East. I mean, there is an Arab Spring going on, and I think European countries especially are on the front row, and they need to participate, and they need to encourage the creation of an environment that is more stable, more democratic, more richer economically, in order for Europe to have its own well-being. It's just as simple as that. I'm afraid that our Russian friend doesn't understand that. Maybe he doesn't like the idea that NATO has had a military success. Maybe that's the reason, I don't know. But from a European standpoint, it's very simple. I mean, we need to have stable countries in Morocco, in Algeria, in Libya, in Egypt, because these people are very close to us, and it's obvious to everybody.
All right, Alexander, I could see you were shaking your head there.
Well, I'm sorry, but you know, if we look back in history, Europe is going through basically an economic crisis, and suddenly we have all those wars. We always have Western governments looking outside the country when things are going badly inside. In France, it's purely for domestic consumption. Come on, President Sarkozy is looking at a defeat at the elections. He needs every opportunity to show that he's actually in control of things.
All right,
the economy is not
Mr.
working.
Russelin,
nothing is not working. So
you've made your point.
Let's not forget those things.
Mr. Russelin, your response?
Well, we'll see who wins the elections in May next year. I mean, we'll see. We'll just see.
All right, we will see. Let's take it back to Ambassador, though. Do you agree with those who say that perhaps really now the emphasis, the international emphasis, should be, once the dust settles in Tripoli, perhaps moves through the UN to recognize the NTC in their role before you rush in with meetings, with more NATO operations, with more international intervention in the country?
I don't think you need to sequence these things. I think they all need to happen. I think that first we have to see that the military conflict is over, and that the Gaddafi regime is finally defeated, and that Gaddafi is no longer posing a threat to the people
Ambassador,
of the country.
how would you release the assets of the former Libyan government to the NTC without some recognition of whether they are the legitimate representatives at this point of the Libyan people? I mean,
I think that they will establish a government, and they will seek that kind of recognition. Governments will make their decisions about recognition, which should also go to the UN. I'm not saying it shouldn't, but these should go simultaneously.
Well, we're going to have to leave the discussion there because we are out of time. Let's thank our guests, Ambassador Kurt Volker, Mr. Alexander Nekrasov, and Mr. Pierre Russelin. It's been great having you gentlemen on this episode of Inside Story. Thank you so much for joining us here on this show of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us, of course, at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, is goodbye.